January 7th, 1990. Daviess County, Kentucky. The nude body of a white male who appears to be in his 30s is found in a remote wooded area. The victim has been shot and severely beaten, and his hands and feet were removed, but since he cannot be identified, he becomes known as the Daviess County John Doe. 17 years later, investigators announced that the John Doe has been identified as Scott Morris, a 14-year-old boy who went missing from Indiana in 1978, but this turns out to be a mistake. Finally, in April of 2024, the decedent is correctly identified as 37-year-old William Mathews, but his murder remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and on this episode, we're going to be covering a pair of cold cases: the 1990 murder of William Mathews and the 1978 disappearance of Scott Morris. On the surface, there would be no reason to assume these two cases are connected, but they wound up being linked together in a truly unusual fashion. Over the years, I've received a couple of requests to cover the story of an unidentified decedent known as the Daviess County John Doe, who was brutally murdered in Kentucky in 1990. Well, just over 3 months before this episode's release, it was announced that DNA testing and genetic genealogy had finally identified the victim as a 37-year-old Louisville resident named William Mathews. Of course, while it's wonderful that William got his name back, this is still technically an unsolved cold case, since a new investigation is currently underway to try and figure out who is responsible for killing him. Now, if you're wondering how Scott Morris fits into this, he was a 14-year-old boy who went missing from Indianapolis, Indiana in August of 1978, but 3 decades later, the Kentucky State Police announced that Scott had been positively identified as being the Daviess County John Doe. But unfortunately, it turned out that a major miscommunication and misinterpretation of the evidence had taken place, and another round of DNA testing would conclusively confirm that Scott was not actually the decedent after all, and the victim became an unidentified John Doe again until this past spring. So this only opens up the question about what actually did happen to Scott. It now seems very unlikely that William Mathews and Scott Morris's cases are connected at all, but since they're both still unsolved, I thought they were both worthy of discussion on today's episode. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. As our Patreon page has over 70 exclusive bonus episodes and archives, which are not available in our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now start exploring the murder of William Mathews and the disappearance of Scott Morris. Our story begins in Daviess County, Kentucky in 1990. On January the 7th, a pair of hunters were searching for rabbits in a wooded area located alongside Pleasant Valley Road, just east of the city of Owensboro and 2.5 miles northwest of the unincorporated community of Philpott. They wound up stumbling across the nude body of a deceased man, which had been concealed by some twigs in a briar thicket about 40 feet away from the road. The Daviess County Sheriff's Office were summoned to the scene and discovered that the victim was not carrying any identification. They estimated that the man was around 25 to 40 years old, between 5 feet and 5'7", and weighed between 125 and 140 pounds. He had brown eyes and curly medium brown hair with some gray on the temples, and even though his skin had a light complexion, his arms had what were described as a quote-unquote farmer's tan. Since it was known to be cold in Kentucky in January, the tanning made investigators speculate that the decedent was not from the area and hailed from a warmer climate. The victim had been shot a total of 6 times with a .22 caliber long rifle, as bullets were lodged in his head, chest, and one of his arms. Since one of the shots was above and behind the left ear, this suggested an execution-style killing. The decedent had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the chest and face, and was disfigured so badly that he was virtually unrecognizable. There was significant damage to his mouth and nose, as one of his eyes was blackened and several of his teeth were knocked out. It's been reported that the victim may have been sexually assaulted, as semen was apparently found inside or on his body. In addition, the perpetrator had gone to the trouble of cutting off both of the victim's hands and feet, possibly in an attempt to conceal his identity. While a cadaver dog was brought in to search the area for the missing body parts, they could not be recovered. The victim's clothing could also not be found anywhere, though a pair of gold-toned prescription eyeglasses were lying near his body. It seemed likely that the man had suffered abuse and torture over a long period of time, but since there was little decomposition on his body, investigators estimated that he was killed only about 36 hours before he was found. And due to the lack of blood at the scene, his murder probably took place at another location before his body wound up in the woods. Since this spot was not easily accessible by vehicle, the perpetrator may have been required to carry the decedent's body for a great distance before dumping it, and the remoteness of the location made investigators suspect that the killer was a local with knowledge of the area. On the night before the body was discovered, a witness who lived down the road from the crime scene recalled seeing what may have been an early 1970s model white and green Ford pickup truck, but otherwise there were no other major leads. There were no missing persons from the area who matched the description of the decedent, which further enforced investigators' belief that he hailed from elsewhere. All attempts to identify him were unsuccessful, so he became known as the Daviess County John Doe, and after a funeral service was held for the man, which was attended by numerous strangers, he was buried in an unmarked grave. At some point over the next several years, the John Doe was exhumed so that a forensic reconstruction and a composite sketch could be produced for his face. The investigation was eventually turned over to the Kentucky State Police, and in August of 2006, the case was assigned to Detective Juan Mormon. 2 months later, Mormon received information that the John Doe's missing hands and feet might still be buried at the spot where his body was discovered, but even though Mormon organized a dig there, nothing was found. In January of 2007, Mormon attended a detectives in-service training which was being offered by the Kentucky State Police Academy and learned about some new techniques which he could utilize in order to identify the decedent. He soon sent a missing person teletype containing the Daviess County John Doe's details to the National Crime Information Center in hopes that there might be a match for him in one of their databases. He wound up getting responses for nearly 20 missing persons who seemed like potential candidates to be the John Doe, but while most of them were ruled out, the most intriguing match was for a missing teenager named Scott Michael Morris, who had vanished when he was 14 years old. On August the 14th, 1978, Scott left his residence in Indianapolis, Indiana, in order to walk to a nearby market, but even though he was later seen leaving the market, Scott never returned home. Since Scott had a prior history of running away, it sounds like his family was initially not that concerned, but 3 days after Scott disappeared, they apparently received a phone call from him. He informed his family that he had joined a carnival and was now in Pennsylvania, but offered his assurances that he was okay before the call ended. Since Scott never resurfaced, his grandmother eventually filed a missing persons report for him later that year. It does not sound like there was much of an investigation for the next 11 years, but sometime in 1989, a friend of the Morris family received another phone call from someone claiming to be Scott. He once again said he was working for a carnival and doing okay, but he would not reveal his exact location, and the conversation was a very brief one before he hung up. When Scott's grandmother learned about the call, she contacted the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department and asked them to enter his information into their missing persons database. For some reason, this wasn't done until years later, but Scott was in the system by the time Detective Mormon started searching for potential matches for the Daviess County John Doe in 2007. Even though the John Doe was not found until 11 and a half years after Scott went missing, Detective Mormon looked at an age-enhanced composite sketch of Scott which had been made in 1997 and thought he bore a resemblance to the decedent and shared a number of his physical characteristics. Mormon soon got in touch with the Morris family and sent them photographs and a composite sketch of the Daviess County John Doe. When the family saw them, they said they were 99% certain that the victim was Scott, as the John Doe seemed to have a striking resemblance to Scott's brothers. This compelled Mormon and some other Kentucky law enforcement officials to travel to Indianapolis to obtain DNA samples from the Morris family, and Scott's relatives even decided to take a trip to Daviess County to visit the location where his body had been found. DNA testing was set to be performed at the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification in Fort Worth, and in September of that year, it was publicly announced that Mormon received official confirmation that Scott Morris had been positively identified as the Daviess County John Doe. This meant that Scott would have been 26 years old at the time of his murder, but of course, this only opened up a number of unanswered questions about how Scott wound up in Kentucky and where he had been during the 11-and-a-half-year period he was missing. One of Scott's brothers, James Morris, told the press that the family always had their suspicions about a man who supposedly had an unhealthy interest in Scott and may have harmed him. In fact, following the identification, James made this statement, quote, "You might have done this to him, but don't think you are going to get away with this because we know who you are and we will make sure you are caught, and that I guarantee if it takes the last breath out of my body." End quote. The Morris family hoped that Scott's body could be transported from Daviess County to Indianapolis and laid to rest alongside his deceased mother. A fund was set up to help the family with the cost for this, and James even brought up the possibility of exhuming Scott in Kentucky and having his body cremated before he was brought back to Indianapolis. However, a year and a half after the identification, the Morris family learned that a serious mistake had been made. In April of 2009, the Kentucky State Police announced that after further steps were taken in the DNA identification process, they discovered that Scott was not actually the Daviess County John Doe after all. So how in the world did this happen? Well, according to Detective Mormon, the improper reading of a blood chart led to the misidentification. After this chart was faxed to the Center for Human Identification, an employee at their lab spoke to Mormon on the phone and gave him a verbal confirmation that Scott had been identified as the John Doe. This prompted Mormon to share the news with the Morris family and the press, but he was unaware that the center was not actually allowed to verbally confirm or deny an identification over the phone. Morris stated, quote, "About a month later, I got a call from another person there asking if we actually had a blood standard, the actual blood of the victim. That's what they actually wanted, and I sent that down there, and from that, they did the test and confirmed it was not a match." End quote. Indeed, 2 separate tests were performed in which a comparison was made between the John Doe's blood and DNA samples which had been taken from the Morris family. The results showed no genetic connection and positively confirmed that Scott was not the decedent. Naturally, the Morris family was left disappointed by the news, but the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department opened up a new investigation into Scott's disappearance, and his information was re-entered into a number of missing persons databases. However, there have not been any new developments these past 15 years, and Scott remains a missing person. So now that the Daviess County John Doe had gone back to being unidentified again, an updated facial reconstruction was created and circulated for the victim in 2021, and one of the images featured him wearing glasses which were similar to the prescription eyeglasses that had been found near his body. The following year, it was announced that the Trans Doe Task Force would be working on this case in conjunction with the Kentucky State Medical Examiner's Office. In case you haven't heard of them, the Trans Doe Task Force is a trans-led nonprofit organization which finds and researches cases involving LGBTQ+ missing and murdered victims, with a primary focus on unidentified individuals who may be transgender. If you'll excuse the outdated terminology, a lot of the original reporting on the Daviess County John Doe case contains statements from the police that the murder may have been quote-unquote connected with homosexual activity. Even though the victim was still unidentified, the Trans Doe Task Force decided to take on this case, as one of their co-founders, Anthony Redgrave, stated, quote, "This person could have been a member of the queer community or targeted in some way because of some sort of bias," end quote. Well, through the usage of genetic genealogy, analysts from the Trans Doe Task Force eventually managed to find a likely match between a sample of the decedent's DNA and members of his biological family. Their findings were sent to the Kentucky State Police, who subsequently reached out to the decedent's family and got a confirmatory DNA test which allowed the identification to be made. On April 19, 2024, the Kentucky State Police announced that the Daviess County John Doe had finally been identified as William Dennis Mathews. At the time of this recording, virtually no details about William's background or his family have been released to the public. All we know is that his birth date was October the 12th, 1952, making him 37 years old at the time of his death, and he was known to have been living in Louisville, Kentucky. The Trans Doe Task Force also issued this statement, quote, "While the Trans Doe Task Force aims to work on LGBTQ+ cases, when a victim is a doe and we don't know their identity or how they identified, we can only rely on clues that a case might fall under our umbrella of services. Not every doe we identify will turn out to be LGBTQ+. Regardless, we are very happy to have been able to provide information to assist with the identification of a person whose name was unknown for far too long," end quote. There is currently an ongoing homicide investigation, but at the moment, William Mathews' murder, as well as Scott Morris's disappearance, continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I think it goes without saying that the murder of William Mathews is one of the most brutal crimes ever covered on this podcast, and even though William has finally gotten his name back after 34 years, he definitely deserves justice for what happened to him. I'm sure you're well aware that over the past several years, DNA testing and genetic genealogy have led to the identification of hundreds of John and Jane Does. So when I started receiving requests to cover the Daviess County John Doe, my plan was to hold off on doing an episode, since I hoped the same thing would eventually happen here. In a lot of these cases, identifying the decedent is only half the battle, because if they were the victim of a homicide, then the next step is figuring out who their killer was. And a lot of these cases involving the identification of decedents, the public finally gets to learn a lot of information about the victim's background. But there are other cases, such as the identification of the John Doe formerly known as Lyle Stevick, in which the decedent's family prefers to maintain their privacy, so all information about them is withheld from the public. At the moment, we know nothing about William Mathews' background other than his birth date and his last known city of residence, and an actual photograph of him has still not been released publicly. It's unclear if this is being done for privacy reasons in order to respect the wishes of William's family, or if law enforcement is withholding as many details as possible in order not to jeopardize an ongoing homicide investigation. Whatever the case, there are definitely a number of unanswered questions about his murder. Right from the outset, investigators believe that the Daviess County John Doe was not killed at the location where his body was found and was not a resident of the area, and indeed, it turned out that William was living approximately 110 miles away in Louisville. So could this mean that William was murdered in Louisville before his body was transported to Daviess County? Or did his death take place elsewhere? Was he held captive and tortured for a prolonged period of time before he was killed? Since law enforcement was unable to match up the John Doe with any known missing persons from the area, I'm guessing that William was never officially reported missing. You can make the assumption that William was estranged from his family, but in many other cases where a John or Jane Doe was identified, it turned out the decedent did have loved ones who cared about them and attempted to file a missing persons report. But back then, law enforcement was a lot more reluctant to launch an investigation if the victim was a legal adult and there was no hard evidence of foul play. William was 37 years old at the time of his death, so for all we know, maybe his family's pleas for assistance were ignored. Until more details are released about William's background, there's nothing else we can really do but speculate. But before we talk any more about William's murder, we have to take a few moments to discuss our second featured cold case on this episode, and that's the 1978 disappearance of Scott Morris. I cannot imagine how devastating it must have been for Scott's family to have him go missing and then learn he had been identified as a John Doe who was brutally murdered in a completely different state over 11 years after the fact. And then, a short time later, they're informed that nope, the victim was not actually Scott after all, and we still don't have any idea what happened to him. One particularly sad detail about this whole situation is that when law enforcement confirmed that Scott was not the John Doe in 2009, it was revealed that his grandmother was still alive at that point at the age of 102. And she had also made sure to never change her phone number after Scott went missing in case he ever tried to get in touch with her. Just imagine living to the age of 100 and finally receiving some answers about your missing grandson, only to soon learn that this so-called resolution was false. I know that when Scott was initially identified, his family was attempting to raise money to have the John Doe's body transported from Kentucky back to Indiana for burial and even a possible cremation. If the mistake had not been corrected before they did this, then that would have made for one hell of an awkward situation. Obviously, a terrible miscommunication took place here, but given that the usage of DNA testing to identify John and Jane Does was far less common back in 2007, and there wasn't as much understanding of how the process worked, I can understand why this might have occurred. These types of identifications are so commonplace today that I would hope it's standard practice for law enforcement to now wait for hard scientific data before announcing the identification of a decedent to the media, rather than just doing so based on verbal confirmation over the phone. We now know that Scott Morris's disappearance has nothing to do with William Mathews' murder, but what actually did happen to him? Well, unfortunately, since there is so little information available about Scott's case, I'm left with a ton of unanswered questions. As far as I can tell, Scott's disappearance didn't receive any media coverage at all when he originally went missing in 1978, and I could not find any mention of him in the newspaper archives prior to the false identification in 2007. If you look up Scott's profile page at the Charlie Project or any of the other missing persons websites, or you've seen the image of him that I used in the cover photo for this episode, you're probably going to think that he looks awfully young for a 14-year-old. And, well, that's because Scott was only 10 years old when that photo was originally taken, and his family just didn't have any more recent ones. Since we know virtually nothing about Scott's background before he went missing, I don't want to speculate about this too much, but given that he apparently had a prior history of running away, you have to wonder if his home life might have been a dysfunctional one. All we do know is that Scott left his residence to go to a nearby market, but even though he was seen leaving the establishment, he never returned home. And then, 3 days later, Scott supposedly phoned his family to let them know he had joined a carnival that was now in Pennsylvania. Of course, we can't confirm if Scott himself actually made that call, though whoever spoke to him may have recognized his voice. 11 years later, a family friend claimed that they received a call from Scott, who said he was still working for the carnival, but would not provide his current whereabouts. When Scott was initially identified as the Daviess County John Doe, I'm sure there was good reason to believe that call was legitimate, since it had been established that Scott was still alive in 1989. But now that it's been confirmed that he was misidentified, who knows if it actually was Scott who made the call? Given that Scott was 14 when he went missing, I'm sure his voice would have changed a bit by the time he called his family friend in 1989, so unless the caller shared a specific piece of information to confirm he was Scott, I have no idea how anyone could be certain if it was him. Granted, if it was a prank call, it's odd that someone would feel compelled to do so for an 11-year-old missing persons case that had generated virtually no publicity, but stranger things have happened. If the caller was Scott, I'm not sure why he would phone this friend instead of someone like his grandmother, but perhaps he had his reasons for not wanting to speak with his family. If Scott did run away, it's hard to imagine a 14-year-old being able to survive that long on their own, but even if he joined a carnival and remained with them for 11 years, what happened to him after 1989? The only lead we seem to have are some cryptic comments from Scott's brother James, who expressed his belief that Scott may have been harmed by a man who was known for having an unhealthy interest in him. However, James made these comments after being informed that Scott had been brutally murdered in Daviess County. Since it turned out this did not actually happen, does Scott's family still have the same feelings about this man? We don't know enough information about this individual to make any assumptions about his culpability, but theoretically, if he did kill Scott and disposed of his body at another location, I can't imagine how weird it must have been for him to hear the news that Scott had been identified as a John Doe in Kentucky. One key piece of information which has never been shared is whether or not Scott had much money or any personal items on him when he left his home to go to the market on the day of his disappearance. If he left everything behind, then I think that would point away from Scott planning to run off and join a carnival, and the more likely explanation is that he was harmed and murdered by someone while heading home. Overall, we just don't have enough evidence to reach a definitive conclusion. As awful as the Daviess County John Doe misidentification was, I suppose the silver lining is that it pulled Scott's disappearance out of obscurity and helped it garner more publicity than it had ever received before. So I do hope that his family receives answers someday. So let's get back to discussing the real Daviess County John Doe, William Mathews. Like I mentioned earlier, at this particular point, we have zero information about William's background, so I have no idea if there was anyone from his personal life who might have had a motive to kill him in such a brutal fashion. Before we start talking about the more logical theories, it's worth mentioning that during the early stages of the investigation, the possibility was pushed forward that the John Doe's murder might have been connected to Satanism. If you go to newspapers.com and track down a copy of the April 8, 1990 edition of the Sunday Courier, a newspaper based out of Evansville, Indiana, you'll find an hilarious article on the front page under the headline, quote, "Dabblers in the occult on the increase, say police." It's obvious that satanic panic was alive and well in Daviess County during this time period, as the article contains this quote, "Last month, police filed 75 complaints and charges against 11 Daviess County youths for allegedly committing criminal acts related to a satanic ritual. Included in the charges were theft, burglary, receiving stolen property, and cruelty to animals." End quote. We then hear from a man named John Rice, described as being the chairman of an Owensboro-based organization called the Satanic Awareness Committee, who mentioned that the Daviess County John Doe just happened to be found on January the 7th, which happened to be St. Wineball Day, the first satanic holiday of the year. And apparently, the observance of St. Wineball Day requires the sacrificial dismemberment of an animal or a human male between the ages of 15 and 33. To be fair, law enforcement made it very clear that they did not believe John Doe's murder was connected to Satanism, and even John Rice walked back on his statement a few days later, confirming that he didn't mean to imply that the decedent's death was some sort of ritual involving cult activity. But I will say that being chairman of the Satanic Awareness Committee is something I would definitely love to put on a resume. Anyway, a more logical theory which has been pushed forward is that William Mathews was the victim of some sort of hate crime. We know his body was nude when he was found, and it's been reported in some circles that he may have been sexually assaulted, as semen was found inside or on his body. But I'm not sure if it was conclusively established that William was assaulted, as it's also possible he could have had consensual sex with another man prior to his death. That may be the reason the earliest reporting of this case has statements from the police about the crime possibly being connected to quote-unquote homosexual activity. Since the victim could have been LGBTQ+, that was the main reason the Trans Doe Task Force assisted with his identification, but of course, like I previously mentioned, no details about William's background have been released publicly at this point, so I'm not going to speculate on his sexual orientation and if it could have played any role in his murder. What we do know for certain is that William was the victim of major overkill, as he was shot 6 times, beaten so badly across the face that he was practically unrecognizable, and had both his hands and feet removed. If William was murdered elsewhere, these appendages were likely disposed of at another location, which would explain why they've never been found. And while I can see someone going to the trouble of removing William's hands to prevent identification via fingerprints, and knocking out several of his teeth to prevent identification via dental records, why would they take the time to cut off his feet? Well, there's been speculation that this case might be connected to the murder of another John Doe, which took place in Kentucky 9 months earlier. On April the 9th, 1989, the nude body of a male victim was discovered inside a tobacco barn in a rural section of Grant County near Williamstown, approximately 180 miles away from the spot where William was found. He had been shot twice in the back of the head with a .22 caliber weapon, and no clothing was at the scene. Since the victim's face was heavily decomposed, this seemed to indicate he had been dead for about 2 weeks before he was found. He was believed to be between 25 to 39 years old and was approximately 6'5" and weighed 230 pounds. The decedent had brown hair that was styled in a crew cut with sideburns, and he suffered from a condition known as plagiocephaly, aka flathead syndrome, which meant the entire back of his head was flat. In addition, he had undergone extensive dental work, as he had a 10-unit fixed porcelain metal bridge to replace some missing teeth. Since he could not be identified, he became known as the Grant County John Doe, but the most noticeable similarity to William's case is that both of this man's hands had been removed and could not be found. This case is currently in the hands of the DNA Doe Project, who now have all the necessary funding for testing, so perhaps the decedent will finally be identified sometime in the near future. As far as I can tell, law enforcement has never officially confirmed or denied if they believe the Grant County John Doe case and William Mathews' murder are connected, but even though there's some noticeable differences between the two crimes, there are also a number of similarities, particularly how both victims were shot multiple times with a .22 caliber weapon, their clothing was removed and missing, and they each had both of their hands removed in a possible attempt to prevent identification. There's been speculation that the Grant County John Doe may have been a victim of the Cornbread Mafia, a nickname given to a group of men from Kentucky who created the largest domestic marijuana production operation in the history of the United States. In fact, in June of 1989, just 2 months after the discovery of John Doe's body, at least 70 men associated with the Cornbread Mafia were arrested on federal charges in a major drug bust. I have no idea if the two events are connected, but given the very distinct dental work he had, it is a bit surprising that the Grant County John Doe has gone this long without being identified. Given that William was murdered several months after the Cornbread Mafia were busted, I don't have much reason to think they have any relevance to his case, but if by chance you believe William and the Grant County John Doe were murdered by the same person, then I suppose the most logical explanation is that both men fell prey to a serial killer who was operating in Kentucky during that time period. Even though William hailed from Louisville, investigators always suspected that his killer was a Daviess County resident who would have needed to have some familiarity with the area in order to find the woods where his body was dumped. In fact, since this spot was not easily accessible by a vehicle and required someone to walk for a distance while carrying William's body, this has led to speculation that perhaps multiple people were involved in his murder. Well, sure enough, there just happened to be a serial killer duo operating in Kentucky during this time period. One of them was James Ray Cable, who had an extensive criminal history and spent time in and out of prison for such offenses as raping a 7-year-old girl and first-degree manslaughter for killing a fellow inmate during his incarceration. While Cable had previously lived in Owensboro, he was residing in Louisville by 1990, and on April 5th of that year, he decided to team up with an accomplice named Philip Clopton in order to kidnap a 15-year-old girl. They proceeded to set up a campsite in a remote area of LaRue County and held the girl captive there for 3 weeks, where she was chained to a tree and repeatedly abused. On April the 26th, Cable had left the campsite to visit his parole officer, but Clopton made the mistake of forgetting to chain the girl to the tree before he fell asleep. The victim then proceeded to pick up Clopton's sawed-off shotgun and fatally shot him before she managed to escape out of the woods and find help. The girl told police that during her time in captivity, she had overheard Cable and Clopton confessed to the murders of Sherry Wilson and Bridget Allen, two 14-year-old girls who had lived in the same neighborhood in Louisville and went missing 3 months before she was abducted. Clopton left behind a diary in which he wrote about scattering the 2 girls' dismembered remains throughout multiple counties, and even though a massive search was performed, all that was ever found was one of Bridget's severed arms, which was floating in Pottinger Creek. While the authorities did not believe there was enough evidence to charge Cable with murder, he was charged with rape, sodomy, and kidnapping, and after the surviving 15-year-old testified against him at trial, Cable received a 300-year sentence in the Kentucky State Penitentiary. Well, in April of 2004, Cable was indicted on 3 charges of first-degree murder after DNA testing linked him to a trio of unsolved homicides from the 1980s. The victims in question were 18-year-old Sandra Gale Kellums, who was murdered in Owensboro in June of 1982, as well as 2 Louisville residents, 26-year-old Oma Marie Bird, who was killed in December of 1986, and 24-year-old Helen Booth, who was killed in May of 1989. Well, Cable never did get the opportunity to stand trial for any of these murders, as he died behind bars in December of 2013 at the age of 65. Now, on the surface, James Ray Cable and Philip Clopton may not seem to be likely suspects in the murder of William Mathews, as even though Cable once killed a fellow male inmate in prison, all of their other known victims were female, so abducting, sexually assaulting, and murdering a 37-year-old male would not seem to be their MO. But it's been reported that they were at least investigated as potential suspects in this crime, which would make sense, since William's murder took place in early January of 1990, the murders of Sherry Wilson and Bridget Allen took place in late January, and their abduction of the 15-year-old occurred in April. While all 3 of the female victims were from Louisville, Cable and Clopton did apparently drive a great distance to scatter Sherry and Bridget's remains, and they held the 15-year-old captive at a campsite which was over 50 miles outside the city. We know that William was living in Louisville at that time, so who's to say that Cable, Clopton, or both of them couldn't have gone elsewhere to dispose of his body, particularly since Cable had previously lived in Owensboro and likely had knowledge of Daviess County. In addition, since Bridget's severed foot was found in a creek, we know these guys were not averse to dismembering their victims and removing their feet. All that being said, it's entirely possible that these guys have already been ruled out as suspects in this crime. In 2004, around the time that DNA testing linked Cable to 3 unsolved murders, the Daviess County Sheriff's Office said that they were planning to perform testing on the DNA evidence from William's murder to see if it matched, but it's unclear if this ever took place. However, in 2015, Detective Jerry Spurrier of the Daviess County Sheriff's Office made a statement about his department having received information about a potential suspect in some other killings. He said the lead was investigated through DNA evidence, but investigators determined there was no connection to the Daviess County John Doe. Well, Spurrier never actually specified who this potential suspect was, and whether or not it could have been James Ray Cable. I mean, since we know forensic testing linked Cable to other murders, they obviously have his DNA on file, so if they've already compared it to the DNA evidence from this case, then it's possible he has already been ruled out. I suppose the wild card here is the possibility that Philip Clopton could have participated in William's murder and the DNA might belong to him. Since Clopton was killed before he could be charged with any crimes, and DNA analysis was not yet a common practice in criminal investigations back in 1990, it's unclear if they ever collected Clopton's DNA or have it on file. The only potential lead in this case was the eyewitness sighting of an early 1970s model white and green Ford pickup truck, which was seen in the area the night before William's body was discovered. At the time of his death, Clopton was driving a 1978 Chevrolet model pickup truck, which was used to abduct their 15-year-old victim, but you have to remember that just because a witness saw a truck near the murder scene does not necessarily mean it was driven by the killer and connected to the crime. Overall, I am inclined to believe that Cable and Clopton were not the perpetrators here, since there is nothing in their backgrounds to suggest they targeted male victims, so with the information we have right now, I think William was probably killed by someone who has never been publicly named as a suspect or person of interest. The murders of unidentified decedents are particularly difficult to solve, since it's hard to know where to focus your investigation when you don't even know who the victim is. But now that William Mathews has his identity back, the authorities can delve into his background and uncover a bunch of potential new leads. So until investigators decide to release more information about the case or William himself to the public, all we can do is sit back and wait. It sounds like DNA evidence belonging to the killer is available, and I'm curious to know if it has ever been entered into any genealogy databases. If so, then it may only be a matter of time before a match is made. For all we know, the perpetrator may have since gone to prison for another crime or is now deceased, but the great thing about DNA profiling and genetic genealogy is that they can posthumously link a suspect to an unsolved cold case even after they're dead. While we have not heard anything from William's surviving family, I am glad they have finally received answers about what happened to him. While law enforcement likely has their reasons for withholding details about William's background from the public, here's hoping that more information comes out over time, so the world can finally learn about William and what kind of person he was. But for now, let's just hope that he receives justice for his murder. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of William Mathews, please contact the Kentucky State Police Post 16 at 270-826-3312. That's 270-826-3312. And if you have any information about the disappearance of Scott Morris, please contact the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department Missing Persons Unit at 317-327-6160. That's 317-327-6160. In addition, if you have any information about the identity or murder of the Grant County John Doe, please contact the Kentucky State Police at 502-564-5230. That's 502-564-5230. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released over 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about an infamous case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1994 disappearance of Tina Marcotte, and the subsequent death of the prime suspect, Tom Keeter, who supposedly ended his own life by allowing his head to be crushed with a forklift. In addition, I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover an unsolved missing persons case, the 1989 disappearance of Melanie Melanson. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Kiara 652010, Andy R, Christy G, and Tammy. Thank you all so much for your support. I'm also excited to announce that this coming fall, I will be attending the Berkshire Podcast Festival, which is taking place in North Adams, Massachusetts from October the 18th until the 20th. It's being organized by Josh Hallmark of the True Crime Bullshit podcast and will feature a number of high-profile shows, including yours truly. If you would like to purchase tickets, please visit our website, berkshirepodcastfestival.com, and use our specialized promo code COLD2024 to get a 35% discount on tickets. Once again, that's berkshirepodcastfestival.com, and use the promo code COLD2024 to get a 35% discount on tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.